we are also victims, because one of the ways in which we're being attacked is that we're so powerful. Why are you looking for other organizations? The legacy organizations, they're big, they're slow, they'll do what they can, but they are not meant actually to create change. You are the one who, we are the ones we've been waiting for. Each of us can do something. We refuse to live in these anti-Semitic conditions that you put us in. We refuse to live as second-class citizens, and we want to go and live in Israel because Israel is our state. It's the country of the Jewish people, and we want to be a part of that.
Hello, everyone. This is another episode of the Zionist Cafe, and today my beautiful guest is Isabella Tabarovsky. Do I express it well? Pronounce it well?
You pronounced it correctly, and It's such a pleasure to be part of your podcast. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, absolutely. I have seen you for years. I'm following you for years already. Here and there, something popped up, and I wrote down, I want to interview her, and never came to that. And now suddenly, yes, we are here.
Wonderful.
So I will explain a little bit who you are. The most of the information will be in the description down. I will put the links there, of course. And for now, I'd like to share that you're a scholar of Soviet anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, contemporary anti-Semitism in a way, and you're a contributor to many books and articles. You are a senior fellow at the Z3 Institute and a fellow at the Wilson Center in DC, Washington, DC.
Yes, exactly.
Your latest book, what I just read, here it is Be a Refusenik, a Jewish student survival guide. And specifically, I think for the Jewish students in the West, America for sure, because that's what you directed to, but Europe can use the same advice. Okay, now your introduction was written by Nathan Sharansky. And I want to share a little bit about that. I'm from the Netherlands, and my mother wanted us as kids to write letters to Soviet prisoners, Jews, who, well, you will talk about that more, who were in such a dire situation, like after the Shoah, the Holocaust. Some of them had went through that, and then an extremely difficult times in the Siberian camps, etc. So I'm raised with that. So we wrote to Nathan Sharansky, right? And my rabbi in Holland, in The Hague, he organized to demonstrate to get the Jews out of Russia, the USSR. So we were demonstrating often in front of the Russian embassy, and specifically too for Nathan Sharansky. And it's so interesting to see his words there. And there was something else that I wanted to tell about. But
first of all, let me jump in. I want to say thank you for those demonstrations. I always say it when I meet. Mostly it's American Jews who I meet, but also British Jews. And, I don't think I've ever met somebody from Holland who told me that they participated in the Soviet Jewry movement. And I'm always really grateful because, I understand how much energy it takes to go get out of your house and protest. And, it was such an active movement. It did so much. It had such huge impact. So thank you for being part of that.
Well, thank you. And we're not so many. It were maybe like 20, 30 people usually. And because the Jewish community is small to begin with in the Netherlands, but still it was beautiful to do that. And I remember when he got liberated or released in 1986, right? I saw it on television that he was walking a zigzag line. Have you seen that?
Yes, of course.
To show I'm not going the straight path. I do what I want.
Yes, it's a very famous episode. I actually describe it in the book. I also have a copy of it here in Be a Refusenik. So there is a chapter that has his story in it. And I describe how exactly, because he refused to obey any commands that the KGB gave him, and all the way until the very end, until the last moment.
So powerful. I remember seeing that as the day of yesterday. Okay, so what I would like to ask you is the following, to maybe set the history. If you can walk through the interesting Soviet relationship with Jews. Interesting is a nice word for what it often was, right? And then also about the Jewish state, Israel, and Zionism. So please go, feel free, share as much as you like.
Well, those are dangerous words because, they usually takes me at least, it's a 90-minute lecture in which I explain it. But, I'll say that, in my research, I mostly focus on the anti-Zionism of the Soviet Union that began in 1967. The USSR was always anti-Zionist, but its anti-Zionism changed over the years. And so 67 was a new way, that's the Six-Day War, when Israel won against Soviet-backed Arab states.
Yeah.
And it set off a massive crisis for the Soviets because they just couldn't understand how such a small country could win against much larger states, which they armed, which they trained, which they supported. And so they really come to the conclusion that there is some massive, ideological enemy behind all of it. And that enemy was Zionism. Again, they didn't just come up with it in 67, but 67 is when they really turned it into this huge scarecrow that they saw operating all around the world and undermining Soviet interests geopolitically around the world, but also internally. And this is where the Refusenik story comes in also, is that because the Soviets were, the USSR was known as a state of state-sponsored anti-Semitism, okay? It was a country of state-sponsored anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism came all the way from the top. But that anti-Semitism took the form of anti-Zionism. And this is what makes it so relevant for the current moment. 67 was also a point where the kind of Jewish dissident movement is born, where Jews are suddenly saying, we refuse to live in these anti-Semitic conditions that you put us in. We refuse to live as second-class citizens, and we want to go and live in Israel because Israel is our state. It's the country of the Jewish people. And we want to be a part of that. And the Soviets actually believe that there's this international Zionist movement, the international Zionism is behind that. And the idea there is to undermine the unity of the Soviet people, all of which is, of course, yes, I mean, there's no unity of any kind, but they are trying to hold this facade together. And so they feel that this internal movement by the people who become known as the Refuseniks, like Sharansky, that it is there in order to crack the foundations of the state.
The paranoia,
The paranoia, exactly. And so that's why, and the more they think about it and the more all of this goes on, the more they believe that they are facing this massive enemy, the Zionist Israel state, together in cahoots with the United States. And it all gets wrapped into their anti-Western ideology and strategy and goals. This is the Cold War. They realize that they can't fight America militarily. They certainly could never defeat it. But they come up with a plan to defeat America through diminishing its, through hearts and minds, basically, through diminishing its influence around the world or into demonizing the United States. And so they demonize the United States among the third world, as it was known then, among the global left. And they, that campaign actually has an effect. I think some of what we see today, the anti-Western sentiments that we see among the global South and among the global left, I think these are remnants of that campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's amazing how powerful that is. And would you like to share something about your book, maybe, but what is the purpose of making it?
So the book, it's interesting. I was having a conversation with someone who said, you could have written a very different book. Why did you write this one? And I think it's very true. Because, it was asked in a good way, because, I'm known as a scholar of Soviet anti-Zionism. And so people for years have been saying, we need a book about Soviet anti-Zionism. I've written a lot of articles.
Yeah,
because I see Soviet anti-Zionism really as a precursor to the anti-Zionism we see today. And so I was kind of working on that. And then October 7th happened. And 2 weeks after October 7th, so I'm in Israel, I live in Israel now, but 2 weeks after October 7th, I found myself in the US with my editor, David Hazoni.
Mm-hmm.
And we started talking about what does this moment need? What is really needed in this moment? And I think we both felt that we needed stories of courage. We needed stories of inspiration.
Yeah.
And I had, among other things, I had been writing about the Refuseniks already for several years. And so that's what we kind of came up with. So the idea was so it's called, again, Be a Refusenik, and you see the image of this powerful kind of the fist holding the Star of David. So Be a Refusenik, a Jewish student survival guide. The idea here is to inspire Jewish students who, of course, on October 7th, or rather October 8th, realized that their whole universities were against them. And I think the Jewish community as a whole realized that so many of their friends and colleagues were against them. And so in the book, I tell stories of the Refuseniks, and I twin them with stories of young American Jews who became prominent after October 7th. Some of them actually even before. Some of them became activists even before October 7th, but they became prominent. And there are some interesting parallels that you see, even though, of course, what American Jewish students are facing on their campuses is nothing compared to, it's not nearly the same in terms of severity and violence that the Refuseniks faced in the USSR, but that's not the point. The point is that they realize there is a rethinking that happens as a result of facing this hostility, a rethinking of what's important for me. What do I want to do with my life in order to maintain my integrity as a Jew? What does it mean to be a Jew in this moment? So both people, and the Refuseniks at that time were very young. People often look at Tabarovsky. Yeah, exactly. In their 20s, 30s at the most. People think of them as this. They remember their pictures already as more older people, but they were very young. So it's the story of two generations of young people who encounter this anti-Zionist hostility and have to figure out what to do. And there are some real stories of inspiration, I think, on both sides.
Yeah. What I'm thinking, we came in 2004 from Europe to America. My kids went to schools here, of course. I have the impression that in general, a lot of people do not know so much what happened in Russia. They're not so well educated. What book would you recommend in addition that should be an obligated history book? Is that would that be Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago? What would you think to get a good historical overview? Because I think there's so much to learn from what happened in Soviet Russia.
Yes.
And also one of the painful thing is the loss of interest in Judaism and religion, because if you for 70 years are deprived from being able to practice, right? That's very effective. And I have several Russian friends here, previous Russian friends. They're really a little bit anti-religion because that's the result. Yes. What would you recommend?
Well, gosh, that's such a difficult question. There are so many great books. I would say, Solzhenitsyn is not it's good advice actually, because I think, I know what I want to recommend. I know.
Okay.
Before I say that, I think so. What I was going to say is that anything that explains what happened under Stalin is, I think, important for Americans today to understand. The history that I describe in my book is more of the history of the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, which I think is very relevant for the current moment. But I think what's missing for many people is the understanding of how did the USSR become just the terror that state produced. And I think it's important because Stalin was Hitler's contemporary. And a lot of Americans know the history of Nazi Germany, and they think that is the worst story of the 20th century, of the European story of the 20th century. But Stalin's story, in some ways, the story of Stalin's USSR, it competes with that very much, right? Because of the Gulag, because of just the horrible, the displacement of, hundreds of millions of people losing their rights, being forcibly dispossessed, displaced, and then, of course, simply persecuted, murdered in the Gulag, or worked to death in the Gulag, including during World War II. The World War II is going on, and the Red Army is, fighting the fight against the Nazis. But meanwhile, in the back on the back end of the country, there are millions of people in the Gulag. So including, by the way, some Americans. And this brings me to the book that I want to recommend. So there's an incredible book by an author, by someone called Tim Tsouliadis, and it's called The Forsaken. It's The Forsaken. It's an incredible book about the Americans who found themselves in Soviet Russia during Stalin's time and what happened to them. You know, they found themselves, some of them came as committed communists. They thought that they're coming in, you know, in the 20s, in the 30s, they're coming to build socialism. There's a lot of optimism. And then they are basically swindled. The NKVD, the precursor of the KGB, basically takes away their passports. And then they're stuck. They can't go anywhere. And then they end up in the Gulag during the terror. Because during the terror, if you were a foreigner, you were suspect of espionage, of subversion. Russians who were suspected of ties with foreigners were suspected of, espionage and subversion. Horrible, horrible period. But this book is written so well. It really paints a picture of the country, of how Americans who were there experienced the country, what the American embassy did and didn't do, how the American government was actually duped into believing some of the lies that Stalin's regime told them. It's a very powerful book. I can't recommend it enough.
That is such a great idea. And what I'm thinking now of, there's so much that is forgotten and not known. For instance, like the prelude to the Holocaust, so to say, like the series of pogroms between 1919 and 22, that like 100,000 Jews were slaughtered in the style of October 7. I have never seen that in any book. I know about it, but it's not, and that is a huge amount of people too, but that's not the group of Jews. But so many people's life was taken in those camps in Siberia. And the fear to live in, that people were educated to betray each other. I mean, I had friends in Boca here, a couple who are kids when they lived there, and they went to America, I think, in their teenage years, and they locked their house so intensely that if I rang the doorbell, several locks had to be opened before they opened the doorbell. And then they say it's like a KGB bastion. Well, I thought I made a joke. They didn't like it because we don't want to hear the word KGB because it was,
it's very
the effect.
Yes, I want to tell you a story. It's fascinating what you just said, actually, because my great-grandfather, who I never met, of course, obviously, he was arrested in 1941, on Trump charges. He was just an ordinary man, a worker doing different kinds of work, was arrested. It turned out that there was somebody, a friend in their circle, who was reporting on all of their conversations.
Yeah.
And they did what so many people do on social media today. The NKVD, the precursor to the KGB, they dug up a few, literally four phrases. It's like digging up 4 tweets from thousands, which could be distorted and misinterpreted. Yeah. And they arrested him and they killed him. They executed him. I got his file a few years ago, and I read the record of the interrogation, of the searches, of everything. It's one of the most painful things I've ever read. But I didn't know about it until maybe a decade ago. Wow. But my whole life, my grandmother, who was his daughter, she was, I think, a teenager when he was arrested. So clearly, you can imagine how terrified she was, having gone through it. Her father getting arrested and then disappearing, and she never saw him again. So her whole life, whenever I stayed with her, she had this really heavy, heavy door with multiple locks and a chain. And every night she would come up to the door and she would close every lock and every chain. And at the end, she would look at through the peephole to see if there was anybody outside. And I remember thinking, what is she afraid of? How silly. Who could be out there outside that door? And it really was only recently that I understood that this was an expression of a consequence of that trauma that she received as a child. And she actually never, she lived that stereotypical kind of life. She and my grandfather, they never talked about any politics in the apartment, or if they did it in the kitchen, in whispers. And if somebody tried to say something louder, they would be like, shh, don't talk so loudly, because the walls hear what you're saying. So it was a completely traumatized generation.
Yeah, and that reverberates through generations, because what I see, but I think I like the collective consciousness of, let's say, Russian Jews who moved to America maybe 50, 100 years ago, or 100, 150 years ago, right? And I see many of them here, like clients I work with as psychologists, very fearful. And I realized if you for centuries live in an area where you're not protected, the law is not protecting you, the Kozak, the police, you had no protection. So you're fearful. And
Yes.
and then you move to a free country, you have to adapt your mindset, but you don't do that because you don't realize that you're too fearful, that you could be less fearful. In
Yes.
a more medical term, paranoia, right? Seeing a problem behind every tree or being fearful of everything. You see that with more people, what an impact that has. And in your book, you write and you speak about that also frequently, the powerful mindset of the Refuseniks. And I find that actually even more interesting because today, nowadays, after October 7th, I have started a group with clients and friends to work through the emotional impact it had on us. And we talked about several things. And I was hoping that many of them would become stronger towards standing up for Israel, speaking out only. Yeah, there's a big group that sends emails and signatures. So you have that on WhatsApp, right? It's great. But to really do a little bit more, to speak up and to don't be afraid. It's so important that we explain the lies, that we defend Israel, that knowledge is spread.
Yes.
No, they didn't dare. They're afraid. I have interviewed people that were not allowed to have I was not allowed to say their last name. Well, my last name, unfortunately, is the only one in the US. So if they want to catch me, they will. But I decide I don't want to live in fear. Sometimes, and I have a tremendous amount of death threats on my record. So don't worry, it's there. But it is something you consciously need to do. And I was touched how you speak and write about the Refuseniks mindset and that they are so strongly rejecting victimhood. So powerful. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, I think it's one of the rejecting victimhood is one of the lessons that I draw out of that story. So I have 6 chapters in the book, and each chapter has that Refusenik mindset segment and a lesson attached to it. So yeah, I think, I love actually how you came to it from the conversation about Stalin's terror, because it's hard to really explain to people who've never experienced it how their parents, the generation of their parents who were born, who came of age maybe during Stalin's terror, how terrified they were, and how that next generation just refused to live in fear, didn't want to anymore. That generation actually came of age during in the post-Stalin era. So the Khrushchev thaw, it was known as Khrushchev thaw. And so they had a brief experience of freedom, like in Soviet terms, very little freedom, but even that felt intoxicating. But yes, I wrote that part. I mean, first of all, because that's what the story was telling me, that they were both that generation of Jews and the young activists today, they refuse the narratives of victimhood. And I think it's really important because victimhood is, it's something that's very popular and very valued today. It's a social currency today in certain circles. And sometimes Jews are encouraged to try to convince others, look, we are also victims, because one of the ways in which we're being attacked is that we're so powerful, classic anti-Semitic tropes, that we're so powerful and we're the oppressors. And so you hear sometimes Jewish organizations actually saying, well, no, but Jews are also victims. And I think we just need to give that up. I think it doesn't mean that we reject the terrible things that happened to us. Of course not. We remember the Holocaust. We know what happened to us. But I think we need to take on more of that Zionist ethos of, yes, it happened to us, but we can do it. We can help ourselves. We can work with our hands. We can work with our heads. We can, we're few, but we can outsmart we think we're smarter, we can think smarter, we can do better. I really think it's a more winning trajectory for us as Jews. I think there is a lot of fear associated with presenting ourselves as powerful, and we need to stop that.
Yeah, I really love that you say that, because you know that victim thinking, you see that all over the world, that people that feel a victim for whatever happened to them, and if you stay stuck in that, I say it in a bit different way, your heart is closed. You're not growing, you're not giving, you're a really poor me, actually, in a way. But there's so much trauma that I respect and have compassion for. And that is why I think that you need to work through that in order to not choose that. And that is like a different step. And I think that's very powerfully described by in your book as well. But I see a lot of resistance to that too, that people are comfortable, and not only Jews at all, but a lot of people are comfortable in that. It has happened to us, and the wounds are big. It's very hard if your entire family has been murdered, and what happened in for generations. It's your DNA. It became part of your DNA. The experience. There's a lot of pain, and I think that is so powerful. How that is manifested in Israel by. They have a totally different mentality around it. And if you compare that with, for instance, general Jews in America that are more living with shame, or don't attack this religion, or are afraid to show they're Jewish. And I see it a little bit different in Europe as well, as far as I have experienced it. And I think it is beautiful to have that new mindset for how can we, it doesn't mean that you go too far the other way around, but I think, you have the Holocaust education, right? You have all the museums and all those memorial things. I think it's important to keep that alive in order to see what people are able to do as a lesson not to do that. But they didn't start to love Jews more because they suffered so much. I've seen it in the Netherlands, was for a few years popular. That was after 1967, and that ended right away with the Yom Kippur War already. It was popular to be Jewish. Oh, that's so interesting. What did your family go through? Always those questions. It became almost like, what an interesting story. Well, no, it's a story of grief and pain.
Right.
And it is, I was so idealistic when I was young because from all this, right? And I was a spokesperson for Amnesty International when I was 21. And I was in the conservatory. My first profession was a classical flautist. None of my musical friends, even though the one that came from Russia, that was still USSR then, they were interested in standing up for other minorities or going to protest or whatever. They were not. And I was the only one. And not that it matters, but okay, I did it. And then I got scolded that we were in Amsterdam, and I was a spokesperson, as I said. And there were a group of Palestinians, and this is in the late 70s, early 80s. They started to, and I wore them again David. So they got the picture. They were scolding at me and scouting, and it resulted in death to the Jews, death to Israel. So I went to my upline, Amnesty International is for everybody, right? I went to my upline, and he said, yeah, you should see what Israel does to the Palestinians. And that is so long ago. And I said, that's not to be compared. It has nothing to do with me. And the complex in the situation with Israel is much more complex than to say Israel's the bad guy and the Arabs are the good guys. It's so ridiculous. But, I talked to a wall and I said, okay, goodbye. Never again 1 cent to Amnesty International. And there are more organizations. What have we been fighting with the UN? I mean, how has the United Nations helped? Again, in your book, the Refuseniks, that they were trying to help people get out, right? That was a good thing. Do you know about that?
Oh, about that, about
the United
what?
Nations, if they were helpful for the Refuseniks?
Oh, no. Of course they were not. No, the United Nations was completely under the heel of the Soviets.
Yeah,
We're talking about,
this is
the 70s, the 80s. No, the Soviets basically took control behind the scenes of the UN.
Like the Muslim states do too, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. By the late 60s, nobody could, they did it thanks to, first of all, there was, of course, the socialist bloc that was a big bloc. And then the Soviets gained so much influence in the third world, in the post-colonial world. This is going back to what I said earlier, they set it for themselves as a strategy. In part, with an eye toward the UN, they understood that with all the newly liberated post-colonial states coming in and becoming members of the UN, they knew that if they had influence over those states, then they could outvote the West in the UN. And they used the UN really as a staging ground for propaganda, for active measures, for all kinds of things, for spying operations. It was a really important spying ground. So no, the UN never helped the Refuseniks. But there are a couple mentions of the UN in the book when Soviet Jews are writing letters to the UN. They're writing these petitions where they're saying, the UN was established to help to uphold universal human rights, and we as Jews need help. We want to live in our land. And they never get any help. They never get any response, nothing. And I don't know if the Refuseniks understood at the time that the extent to which the Soviets controlled the UN. But yeah, they never got any help.
But today, today is the same situation. I mean, look towards Israel. It's like beyond ridiculous. Or that Iran is on the chair of women's rights. I mean, can you make it more funny? It is not funny, of course, but...
Yes. Well, the UN, what happened at the UN, and this is something that Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the American ambassador to the UN, at the time when the Zionism is Racism resolution was adopted, he wrote about the moral inversion that the Soviets essentially introduced via the UN. He saw that what they were trying to do was really distort the truth and the reality, where all these countries that were themselves horrible abusers of human rights, that were sometimes run by genocidal dictators, were accused, and of course the USSR itself was, what human rights in the USSR? It's like it's a completely authoritarian state. And yet they were accusing the West of the worst abuses of human rights. And so this moral inversion took hold, which we are living with to this day. It didn't start yesterday, it didn't start after October 7th, it didn't start even a few years ago. This is a carryover. This is the UN's institutional culture that has been there for decades.
Yeah, and it's such a pity because it has been established with great intentions. But so something totally different, you probably know that too, is what do you think is the original start of being so anti-Semitic in Russia, in those East European countries? Is that the Catholic Church with that kind of anti-Semitism? What do you think is it?
Well, I mean, the church in Russia, of course, was Russian Orthodox, so it's a different church. Look, I mean, I think it's complicated. Russia inherited its Jewish population essentially with Catherine the Great after one of her conquests. And I think Russian czars never really knew what to do with that strange population of people who were living, in kind of what today is Ukraine and Poland. Most of them were, and also Belarus. So I think that there was suspicion on religious grounds, there was suspicion on cultural grounds, and Jews really were truly, I think by the time the Russian Revolution happens in 1917, Jews are the most oppressed group in the Russian Empire. In Europe, Jews got emancipated in the 19th century, they acquired rights. In Russia, it never happened, because there was always kind of this, there would be a movement to emancipate the Jews, and then they would, push it back. The conservative, the religious circles, political circles in the Russian Empire were always against that. Jews were confined to a territory known as the Pale of Settlement, beyond which they couldn't travel beyond that with special permission, and even without a special permission, and even within that territory, because I have family that come from that territory. If you lived in a shtetl, in a small, in a small town, and let's say you wanted to go and study in Kiev, that required special permissions. We actually, in my family, have records of my great-grandfather on that side requesting permission of the governor of Kiev to come and study in Kiev, and then he has to write a special petition to be able to move to live in a place where Jews were not really permitted to live in Kiev, and he's denied. So it was very, very difficult. And then, and then the Soviets come in and they say, we're going to eliminate anti-Semitism because we're socialists, and socialists cannot be anti-Semitic by definition, because we're internationalists. Everybody's equal. So if you Jews join us in our fight, then the pogroms will end, the anti-Semitism will disappear. And so they say all of that, but in parallel with that, they are against Zionism, because Zionism is nationalism. And they say, you Jews don't need Zionism. You don't need to go to Palestine. You can stay here, we'll liberate you here. And of course, they never do. The anti-Semitism never disappears. But anti-Zionism actually becomes fused with anti-Semitism under Stalin. And then that fusion never it just remains a permanent feature of Soviet culture, Soviet political culture, and Soviet social culture.
It's so strange. And you explained also so well in one of your interviews how it fluctuates, like how it, by some people was some Jews joined right away the Zionist movement. They felt like yes, and some others not at all, and which is always the case, right?
Right.
And sometimes I think if there was no anti-Semitism, well, that's true, of course. If you are against Zionism, then stop persecuting your Jews, because there is less of a need to go to Israel and to establish an own country. But it gave also to have an own country is of course totally different. It gives you a feeling of safety, and I personally think the world should really be shut up in a way like this. Nobody opened the door for the European Jews in 1939, 1940. No country it wanted to take in Jews. The result is what we all know. And now telling us we should not have our own country, while most of the country is bought, paid for. Some Arabs have made a lot of money from the Jews that paid for their stuff. So that all this, for me, it's like crazy how it continues to twist the things around. What is it, the elderly of Zion? What is that? The blood libels.
The elders of Zion.
The what?
The protocols of the elders of
the
Zion.
Protocols, definitely written by somebody that had a huge fantasy, right? They're again used. They're again used.
Yes. Well, and the anti-Zionism that we see today really follows the same tropes. So the protocols talk about Jewish control and power, and Jewish control of politicians and media and finances. And this is what we hear is said about Zionists. So the tropes are the same, so the protocols, the main part of the central feature of the protocols is conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy theory about Jewish influence and power and evil. And anti-Zionism is that too. It's a conspiracy theory about Zionist Jews. Evil and influence and power, and it's like the intersection there in terms of tropes and structure is literally the Venn diagram is going to be just basically one circle laid over the other, and that's what makes it so toxic. I was actually, just before our interview, I was watching some videos online of a demonstration that's happening in Amsterdam. I think it was today or yesterday, with, all the chants about how Zionists are Nazis. And, there is so much in that libel. It's one of the most enduring libels about Zionism, that Zionism is like the Nazis. There is so much there that's so evocative of classic anti-Semitic tropes. So in classic anti-Semitism, they equate Jews with the devil. Well, for the leftists are atheists, so they don't equate Jews with the devil, but they equate them with the next thing that's closest to the devil, which is the Nazis, essentially, in the left-wing kind of universe and perception. It's reminiscent of the accusations of like the blood libel, the Jews murder. If you murder children, Christian children, well, if you call Jews Nazis, then that evokes that libel as well. And then it also creates this, again, we were talking about moral inversion. If you are a European and you used to feel bad and guilty about the Holocaust. Well, if you now hear that Jews are just the Nazis, or Zionists are the Nazis, then it's like, well, okay, good.
Yes.
If Jews can be the Nazis, then I don't need to worry so much about what we did to them.
Exactly. I'm saying that
Right?
for years. Thank you for
Yes.
bringing that up because it is
Yes.
like a collective feelings of guilt. But
Yeah.
as a people, as Dutch, I know, and you don't want to feel guilty. Nobody wants to feel guilty. It's a nasty feeling. I
Yes.
heard that from that I was 12, 13, 14 years old. They told me that, well, you do this, you do that. No, it's that's so crazy. So
Yes.
yeah, it is even
Exactly.
taking away the fact of the suffering. Like, oh, I was not attacking France. Hey, what did your grandparents do in the war? Did they protect Jews? I thought
Mhm.
about it regularly. Like, what would because it's in your mindset. It is around.
Right.
It is so weird. It is so weird, and I don't know. That is very hard to. I know actually some Jews that also said, and pretty educated Jews that says like what Israel is doing is like what the Nazis are doing, like in Gaza, totally missing the facts of reality.
Yes,
And but
exactly.
we live now in a time that it is because maybe the social media, I don't know. I sometimes think, where is the time been that we were thinking about something before we spoke, or that we wanted to fact check before we came with an opinion?
Right.
Today is not so much fact checking, and where do you check the facts to begin with?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and
It's
and
all
and
about, yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. It's all about these sharp takes, and everybody's trying to game the algorithm so that the algorithm picks up their
yeah, the
posting.
clickbaits.
Yeah, clickbaits, exactly. So it's a very bad environment right now.
Yeah,
So yeah, just a very bad environment that encourages the worst behavior in people. Let's put it that
yeah.
way. So
What I learned as a kid, and that was for me like almost romantic, the stories that from Russia, very highly educated people went to the Palestine, the land of Palestine, let's say, in the 1850s, even before 1880,
mhm.
yeah, because they wanted to create like the kolkhoz idea of the kibbutzim, right? And I think that is wonderful on itself. Rebuilding the land, they came from an educated profession to do work the land with their hands, really
Right.
from a page, and the pioneers, right?
Mm.
And they brought that atmosphere of. I loved the idea of the kibbutzim as a kid. I was like, I wish I grew up there because you could play around. It's like safe, right? It is a beautiful and community idea. It's still functioning in a different way. But how high is the percentage that you think of Russian Jews that came all over to Israel from that time until now? You have any
Mm.
idea?
Well, I don't think I could give you a percentage. It's certainly, I mean, Russian Jews or Russian speaking Jews certainly played a very important role in the
Yeah,
establishment
yeah,
of the state. And I think a lot of times people also forget that actually Herzl's Zionist movement,
yeah,
the strongest contingent in that movement was the Jews of the Russian Empire.
yeah,
People often talk about Zionism as this European thing, but the biggest supporters for the movement were Jews from Eastern Europe,
yeah,
precisely because from Russia, because the Russian Empire, precisely because they were so oppressed, and
yeah,
precisely because they saw young people saw no future for themselves in the
yeah,
Russian Empire. And so I think the message of Zionism, the message that we can do it, we were talking about like victimhood, right? They didn't want to be victims. They thought, okay, this is an optimistic message. It's a message
yeah.
of our returning to our roots and building something new and moving away from these bloodlands where we are being killed and oppressed. And so the Russian Jews, Russian-speaking Jews certainly played a very important role. After the USSR fell apart, or from the late 1980s through the 1990s, which is when we left, it's 1.5 million Jews from Russia came to Israel, and they really played an important role in strengthening and building Israel's high-tech industry. And so, yeah, it's been a very important influence.
Yeah, that's something to be. That's very impressive. I know that has not been realized often. You think
Mm.
it's because of of, yeah, how it's situated in Western Europe, and from every country there are people coming, but in small amounts.
Well, and
Wow.
also I'll just add something else that,
Mm-hmm.
before the Holocaust, the majority of Jews, I believe, actually lived, well, let's say before the revolution, before the
In
revolution.
Russia, yeah?
In Russia, the majority of Jews lived in Russia. I mean, of course, in the 1880s, 5 million Jews left. They went to America because of pogroms. So that number already diminished, but the majority of Jews were there. And I think that's why, if a large population of Jews was going to come, then it makes sense that so many of them came from Russia and they influenced the establishment of the state and the culture of the state.
Yeah. That's so wonderful on itself. So, would you like to explain a little bit more about the Refusenik mindset that is so well defined by you and so important for young people today? And before you do that, I would like you to say also something. Where do you think people take their Jewish identity from, as what you would advocate with this? By belonging to an ethnic group, right? Is that the reason? Do we include some religion or all religion in it? Where is, because people that for instance are scientists, believe they're scientists. There's an anti-religion mentality in the Netherlands. Pro-socialism, anti-religion. Oh yeah, but I got be laughed at by my friends when I bought my first Siddur when I was 21. So I was like, suddenly, do you need something now, therapy or whatever, right? Yeah. So where do people define that it is a good thing to be Jewish, because the negativity is so big? And I understand that a lot of people walk away from that, right? What would your answer be to them?
Well, look, so you want me to start with, I mean,
Yeah,
I
I
think
gave two questions in one. That's terrible. Choose the question you like. That's me. Yeah.
Well, so why don't I start with, they're intertwined anyway. So what I was going to say is that one of the lessons in the book, one of the chapters in the book, it's actually, I think, the chapter I start with, is called Reclaim Your Zionism. So this is one of the things that the Refuseniks do. They live in this highly anti-Zionist country where essentially a Zionist is considered a traitor, somebody who undermines, who is against socialism, who is against communism, somebody who is dangerous to the Soviet Union. So it's an enemy. Essentially, a
Yeah.
Zionist is an enemy.
Yeah.
And of course, there is a state apparatus to enforce this point of view. It's a country where everybody has to follow the party line, right? You're not allowed to dissent openly, or if you do, you get punished.
Yeah.
And so, but the Refuseniks do exactly that. They reclaim their Zionism in this environment. They say, okay, well, if you tell us that we need to give up our attachment to our people and to the state of Israel, that we're actually going to do the opposite. You are not allowing us to go to Israel, so we're going to be here. We're going to sit and explore what does it mean to be a Zionist, and we're going to reclaim it. Essentially, this is what happens, right? And this is actually an important point, because I think the Refusenik movement is mostly associated or thought of as the movement for immigration, which is correct. It's how it was framed for political reasons, in order to mobilize people. But what Refuseniks did is that they sat for years waiting for permission to emigrate. And what they filled their days with was this exploration of what does it mean to be a Jew? This goes back to your question, to the second question. What does it mean? So this state discriminates against us. It says that we are second-class citizens because we are Jews. But what does it mean to be a Jew? I don't even know what it means. Because by then, by 67, 68, 69, essentially, you don't have Jewish culture in the USSR. They've eliminated it.
Yeah.
There's a handful of synagogues left, mostly for propagandistic purposes, so that they can say to the West, look, we have synagogues. We don't need more because young people are not interested in religion. But young people are not interested in religion because they're not being brought up that way, and because they don't educate new clergy. So anyway, so all, Hebrew is prohibited, Yiddish is dead, basically. So there's nothing left. And the Refuseniks are asking themselves, okay, well, so I'm being discriminated against as a Jew. I can't get into a university I want to get into because I'm a Jew. There are professions that are close to me because I'm a Jew. There are career paths that are close to me because I'm a Jew. But what does it mean to be a Jew? And so that exploration and that focus and that kind of, the process of looking for the answers to these questions is what really is the great kind of legacy of their movement. Because I think today we also are having to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a Jew? Just as you asked me right now. And I would say that, I think for American Jews in particular, they defined their Jewishness as religion exclusively. But we are, of course, not just a religion, we're also an ethnic group. And that is really important. It's, by the way, it's one of the reasons, you see, for Soviet Jews, for ex-Soviet Jews like myself, we didn't have religion, but we had a very strong understanding of ourselves as an ethnic minority, because we were discriminated against on that basis. Not
as a result,
Yes. And that's why for us, identification with the state of Israel comes so easily, because we understand the idea of Jews as a people, being Jewish as being a people and having your own country and running your own affairs. I think American Jews resisted this aspect for a very long time. And that's why I think now so many are lost at this moment when, Israel is being attacked. And so many of them probably think to themselves, well, but I've never, I'm critical of Israel. So why are you attacking me? Why are you attacking my synagogue? In my synagogue, we're very liberal and we criticize Netanyahu and we criticize the Israeli government. And what they don't understand is that anti-Semites never separate Jewish identity, right? For them, it's always both. It's everything. It's religion, it's ethnicity, it's your Jewish food, it's your Jewish state, it's everything. And so I think what's really important for American Jews is to recall that part, to recall, and this is where, I'm often asked, okay, what is Zionism? A lot of people say Zionism is a belief in the Jewish self-determination in the land of Israel. I actually answered a little bit differently. I think that is correct, but I also think that Zionism today means having a sense of Jewish peoplehood, understanding that we are a people, whether you're in Miami or in Los Angeles or in Israel, we are a people. And from here, so much flows. Once you understand it, then you see the attacks against you in a different perspective. And you also understand your own choices and potential courses of action from a different perspective.
So well said. And that is also my experience. I got through the internet, wonderful new friends after October 7th, and I lost wonderful friends. That's so wonderfully sad as it is. And I see actually Israel or Israeli Jews as the most successful group of indigenous people to rebuild their homeland they were thrown out from. And I think that is, it's provocative. When I changed the name from this channel was first Golda's Girls, right? With 6-7 women, an homage to Golda Meir. And then I realized, no, that's nice, great. But who knows Golda Meir? Elderly Jews. That's not why I do the channel. Who else knows it? Educated people. That's not our target group. So then I changed it in Zionist Cafe. Most Jews that heard it, like, oh, do you dare to do that? Why would you do that? Because the word Zionist, I'm a super Zionist. Yes. You mentioned Amsterdam. I'm going to look at that now too. It makes me always a little bit nauseous already. In Amsterdam, there is an amazing art academy that over the entire world, people are studying. It's like a crème de la crème, the Rietveld Academy. They have a doormat in front, forbidden for Zionists. Wow. In the city, I can tell you many stories. In the city where most of the Jews were collected and from there transported to be murdered. Yeah. And they defend it. It's a bit, it's not so nice, but, and I personally do not know, I don't have an answer, how to be able to penetrate the mindsets of so many young people that have the wrong information in their bloodstream, right? And how to get all the lies out there, I don't know.
Yeah.
I would love to make full-time videos every day, one if that would help. I don't know. But what can we do about it? What is do you have any answer? And then we close with that.
Well, I don't think that there is a simple answer, to be honest with
Mm-hmm.
you. In some ways, I think that, well, young people is a separate story, So what I was going to say is I'm often asked, how do we change the minds of the anti-Zionists?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to answer a different question first, and then I will go to the question you actually asked. I think that we shouldn't focus so much on changing the minds of those who are already convinced, like the people who are putting that doormat in front of a music or in front of an arts academy that says no Zionists here. You can't change the minds of those people.
Yeah.
But I think we should be working to inform the people who have kind of a good faith interest in understanding what is going on. People who don't want to engage with you will not engage with you. There's no point in that. But I think that there are plenty of people who do want to engage with us, and I think we should be really working with them.
Yeah.
Now, young people, I think, it's a separate category, because young people are so influenced by their environment that they're in, by the the environment in schools, in universities. They want to fit in mostly. Most of them want to fit in.
Yeah.
And
be liked and loved.
Be liked and loved, exactly, completely natural. And for young people, especially for teenagers, friends are everything. This is
peer groups,
peer groups, exactly. I think that the solutions, I don't think that there are simple solutions. I think that what we're facing, and I think it's important to understand this, is the problem we're facing. It's a generational problem.
Mm-hmm.
We need to understand that we now have a generation of young people. It's actually several generations of young people who were brought up in the anti-Western ideology. And these two go together, anti-Semitism and anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism,
totally.
Right? Anti-Zionism, it goes together. It was created in that way. It was built in that way. And so we need to be changing our education systems.
Yeah.
How? I don't know. That's not what I do for a living. I don't have answers, but I think there are people who have answers, and we need to be rebuilding. And I think for people who are young, who are having children, it's also really important to understand for young Jews who are starting families, it all really ultimately comes from the family. And, we have generations of Jewish parents who themselves gave up on any kind of observance or any kind of connection with Israel. And so then if they did not give to their children a sense of purpose and meaning around being Jewish, then where would they get it from? Then when these children reach for meaning and purpose, they will take it from their peers, and their peers will give them the anti-Western and anti-Israel, anti-Jewish perspective. Natasha Ronsky has a very, he says it really well. We did a launch of the Refusenik at the Begin Center in Jerusalem. And he said on stage that he learned, he spent a lot of time traveling around American campuses when he was the head of the Jewish Agency. And he says he came to the conclusion that if in the family if a Jewish family was religiously observant, then the next generation of children will stick to their Jewishness.
Mm-hmm.
If the family was not observant, but it was Zionist and it was attached to Israel, then the next generation of children would be Jewish. They would just have a different identification, but they would be Jewish.
Yeah.
If both are present in the family, that's great. If only one is present in the family, it's good. If neither is there, then the children will abandon any attachment and any identification.
Totally agree with that. Totally. Wow, that is interesting. When is your book launched, actually?
So November of last year.
Yeah,
so it's been close to 6 months.
There is a beauty. I hope you will sell it to many. There was a beautiful forward. Oh, he said here something. I have 2 quotes that I want to end with. All new anti-Semitism, real change occurs when each person stops being controlled by fear and starts acting independently. Of course, that's what you choose. And I want to share something about the mentality and the encouragement, what you wrote in a few words. Choose courage, page 190. Choose courage. choose resilience, choose defiance, choose to fight for your people, your dignity, and your Jewish future. And I find that a beautiful ending for this wonderful interview that you gave us and the information you shared. I'm very grateful for people like you because you make changes in the world, and that is so needed. And I wish you best of luck, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And it's been such a pleasure to join Zionist Cafe. And I want to say, by the way, that you are exactly what you preach. You are a person who is making change in your world by running this podcast. And I'll add one more thought, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
That I think a lot of times I hear today people say, well, legacy Jewish organizations are not doing enough. They need to do more. I want to say, maybe it's just me being a little bit contrarian, but I want to say that, why are you looking for other organizations? The legacy organizations, they're big, they're slow, they'll do what they can, but they are not meant actually to create change. You are the one who, we are the ones we've been waiting for. Each of us can do something. Each of us can make change in the world.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to be doing, each of us in our place. And that's how we will create something meaningful that will create change on the bigger level.
That's so well said. And I totally agree with you. And it is also always easier to point the finger from, they are not doing it right. It's them. It's like, okay, what do you do yourself? Yeah. Exactly. And I'm really thrilled. That's the positivity that came out of such an atrocity as from October 7th, that I see online young people and also some older people doing some great work and stepping up the plate and and that's fantastic. Well, thank you again, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Have you been suffering a lot through getting out of your bed in the middle of the night for the alarms?
When in Jerusalem it hasn't been so bad, and the last few days have been much better, so I'm starting to recover my sleep, which is a blessing. So but
well,
thank you so much.
Best.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Take care. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We have a small request, and you probably know what it is about, but we have this very interesting situation that 91% of our returning viewers do not subscribe, but they are returning, so they must like it. And that would be great if that is you, if you will be so kind to subscribe, eventually leave a like if you like the video, or even leave a comment, that's even nicer, or have a request. That would be great to hear from you. But please support our work by subscribing. Thank you so very much. That would be such a favor to us.